Let's talk about universal design and accessibility. At the top of the guide for today, you will see some learning objectives, and that's what you need to focus on as we go through this information. The first thing that I'd like for you to do, though, is to review some of the terms related to justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, or JEDI, that we've talked about previously in this class. So make sure you are clear on the definition and think of it in your own terms too, not just what you copy and paste or type in from another source for justice, equity, diversity, inclusion, and social determinants of health. Think to how these terms relate to the profession of occupational therapy. Now on to accessibility and universal design. Let's start by just talking about the broader term of accessibility. And I want to provide a little history on this for context. So the civil rights movement, which we are familiar with because we know it inspired disability rights, the disability rights movement during the late 60s and early 70s. Whoops, sorry about that. These laws prohibited discrimination against people with any sort of difference, diversity, including disabilities. And that means when it comes to education, public accommodations, transportation, and even telecommunication. Way back in the early 20th century, the average lifespan was only 47 years. People with a spinal cord injury had only a 10% chance of surviving more than 5 years after they sustained that injury. Most people with chronic health conditions lived in nursing institutions. And that isn't just mental health, that's physical conditions as well. So that's vastly different than it is today, when the average lifespan is 76 and at least 20% of our population has some type of disability. And we are much more up to speed about what discrimination is, about equal accessibility, and occupational justice. So those specific laws, let's talk about that. In the 1950s, we had a movement in the legislature called the barrier-free movement. And this was established to create opportunities outside of institutional health care. So looking at how we can move people out of institutions in many cases and set them up in their home, in the community, in a supported living situation that had minimized barriers for them, whatever those barriers may be, according to their specific challenges. So from that, then in the late 60s, we had a law that was called the Architectural Barriers Act of 1968. And this law required that all buildings leased, designed, altered, or constructed with federal funds had to be made accessible for people with disabilities. So that's a wide range of buildings. Then a few years later, we had the Rehab Act of 1973, which we've already spoken about in this course, and that's why it's in orange on the slide. That was the first civil rights law for people with disabilities. It made it illegal for others to discriminate on the basis of disability. Just right after that, we had the first version of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA. That was in 1975. And as we know, because we've talked about it before, this law allowed for free education for all children with disabilities. In the late 80s, we had the Fair Housing Act of 1988, and that, as compared to the Architectural Barriers Act, it not only included people with disabilities, but also their families. And it went into some private housing as well, saying that there should be a degree of accessibility in rented apartments, leased buildings used for businesses and so forth. And this was a precursor to what the big one, which came in 1990, the Americans with Disabilities Act, or as we call it, the ADA. And again, this first was enacted in 1990. This law prohibits discrimination in employment, public places, transportation, all sorts of things for people with disabilities. So this was a big one, really important to take away. Let's go back and talk about that overarching term of accessibility. Now, something I want you to note about this is that accessibility is about more than compliance with ADA standards. It's about looking for solutions that allow access for people with disabilities, but even more than that, other people as well. And so when that happens, when we pull in everybody, when we're looking at how can we all equitably access things, that's called universal design, which we're going to get into. Accessibility, though, is when the needs of people with disabilities are specifically considered, and products, services, and facilities are built or modified so that they can be used by people with disabilities, and under the universal design concept, by people, by all people. So unfortunately, this video doesn't work. So hold on 1 second.
Opening doors, putting things in the car, or going up a few steps are things that most people don't think twice about. But what if you had a disability?
Things change for people who have disabilities. I have spina bifida. I use a cane to walk. Dragging my backpack up the stairs is hard.
When some tasks seem out of reach, Dr. Neville Jan uses universally designed objects like this grabber and rolling backpack.
Universal design is a way to think about designing the world, essentially. It looks at products, it looks at environments, it looks at processes, and tries to make them as usable as possible for the largest portion of the population.
Curb cuts and automatic doors are also universally designed and are user-friendly for everyone, not just people with disabilities.
Universal design has a lot to teach society or get society so that they're aware of different people's needs.
It just takes a split second for something to happen and your abilities to change for you to see that, you know, our physical environment isn't as supportive as it could be.
For Colin, that split second happened 6 years ago.
I did a belly flop into some leaves from a 6-foot tree branch and ended up hyperextending my neck,
Leaving him with C4 quadriplegia. Now he's a graduate student at USC and lives in a universally designed apartment complete with automatic door sensors and a slide-in shower chair. These adaptations make Colin's apartment accessible to him, but just because something is accessible doesn't mean it's universally designed. Universal design is meant to be incorporated in everyday design and isn't obviously marked as accessible, like this water fountain with 2 different height options. Big handicap signs that mark accessibility can also leave a mark on those using them.
Handicap signs are very stigmatizing. My vision is that in a universally designed world, there won't be these big blue handicap signs.
Until that day, Dr. Neville Jan will continue to help society understand universal design and how different our world could be. Lexi Cook reporting, ATVN.
So universal design, by definition, is the design of products and environments to be usable by all people. So that's the difference between accessibility and universal design. Is accessibility is specifically when we're thinking about setting things up for people with disabilities. And universal design is when it's like a one size fits all. It's when we set things up for people with all abilities. There are 7 principles of universal design.
So take a moment to consider the physical space that surrounds you. How usable is that space? How usable are the products that you use? How do you even start evaluating the usability of something? Ta-da! The 7 principles of universal design. That's what they're for. They can be used to evaluate the usability of existing designs and can be used during the design process to really help guide the design of spaces and products to being more usable by more people. Let's look at the 7 principles of universal design together. And as we go through these, I want you to be thinking about your own physical space, your home, your office, your car. Think of examples that comply with these principles and think of examples that, oopsie daisies, violate these principles. The first one is equitable use. The design is useful and marketable to people with diverse abilities. And our classic example here is that staircase with the ramp built in, intrinsically a part of the design of our staircase, right? So users who are using a walker, a wheelchair, maybe they're pushing a stroller, maybe they're using crutches, maybe they're walking fine with both legs, but they're maybe rolling a bicycle, or what else? It could be the UPS guy with a dolly full of packages, right? They're all able to use this space to arrive at the front door of the building that's up there, right? The entrance is equally safe and equally appealing to all users. That's equitable use. Flexibility in use, the design accommodates a wide range of individual preferences and abilities. So here we see my vegetable peeler again. And oops. That's the design that's easy to hold and use for everyone, not just users with arthritis for whom it was originally designed. I'm going to let you come up with some better examples of this one. There are lots. Simple and intuitive use is next. So use of the design is easy to understand, regardless of the user's experience, knowledge, language skills, or current concentration level. So here we see the directions for my daughter's birthday cake that I need to follow tonight to make her birthday cake. So you can see the directions use pictures for the ingredients along the top, pictures of the 3 steps along the left side. And even at the bottom, it's kind of hard to see, but there's different baking pans and times along the bottom. The directions are easy to follow. And then sometimes there are directions that appear to be easy to follow, and they are in theory, but in practice, that step does not yield the desired result, does it? So sometimes the directions that seem simple and intuitive, in fact, cause the most confusion and frustration. Next one, perceptible information. The next time you are crossing the street, you will hear that voice counting down the seconds that you have left to cross. And I want you to think about our class, and I want you to think about this universal design principle of perceptible information. Not only are you seeing the picture of the hand, the digital display of the numbers counting down, but you also hear, and this is important for the visually impaired, the verbal countdown informing the pedestrian how much time is left to cross the street. So that uses the senses of hearing and vision, right? The design communicates necessary information effectively to the user, regardless of ambient conditions or the user's sensory abilities. Okay, what's the next one? Tolerance for error. And Juan Carlos Morales gets credit for this photo. He was a previous student of mine. The design minimizes hazards and the adverse consequences of accidental or unintended actions. So here we see that, oopsies, come back to me. Here we see, oopsies, come back to me. There we go. We see the double-sided key. So a lot of keys have to have a specific vertical orientation. You have to put it in the right way in order for it to work. Not this key. No worries, if you put it in upside down, it will still work. That's a great example of tolerance for error. Thank you, Juan Carlos. Low physical effort. The design can be used efficiently and comfortably and with a minimum of fatigue. So here's that ceiling fan, and you got to go grab the chair and pull the chair over in order to grab at those, in order to be able to reach those little chain pulley things. That is not low physical effort. That's difficult. And that's why, a lot of times we tie on strings or some sort of tassel onto those things, making them easier to reach from the floor level. By design, not low physical effort. Size and space for approach and use. Appropriate size and space is provided for approach, reach, manipulation, and use, regardless of user's body size, posture, or mobility. So what does that mean? Check this out. Look at that store aisle. Yeah, I can't even imagine trying to push my kid's stroller through that aisle. First of all, they'd be grabbing at the candy left and right. But then, what do I do if someone else comes down the aisle the opposite direction, or I have to turn that corner with my big old stroller? It's not happening. Not enough space to use those aisles. Contrasted with this big, nice, big, wide aisle that allows lots of users, the space that they need to get through the store aisles easily. Okay, that was size and space for approach and use. All right. These principles are the foundation of universal design in the physical world that surrounds us. What about your physical world? So your kitchen, your office, your classrooms, the restaurants that you go to, the stores where you shop, how would they stack up against these principles? Let me know. I want you to share your examples.
So let's take that and talk about how universal design fits in with the OTPF, the Occupational Therapy Practice Framework that we've learned about in this course. The most obvious way to me is that we in OT always consider environment and context. So in physical environment being a big part of what we consider as context. So where people are doing what their occupations and even how they're doing that. Universal design emphasizes that issues of convenience, mobility, accessibility, and visitability are not limited to their home alone, but extended into the areas around their home, so their community. Now, I just mentioned a term I want to talk about, visitability. I'm not going to ask you to remember this, but I just like this term, so I thought I'd bring it up. And if you ever specialized in universal design and accessibility, things like that in your OT practice, visitability is a word you would use a lot. It means the ability or the setup of somebody's home so that people with varying abilities, and really specifically people with mobility challenges, are able to safely access the home, even just for a short amount of time. So even just for a couple hour visit or maybe one overnight visit, something like that. So think about the visitability of your home. If someone were to come over to see you or to hang out with you, and they were in a wheelchair or on a walker or had low vision, how safe would your home be? Very likely, as in the case of most of us, that person would require additional assistance. So in other words, their independence would be decreased while they're visiting our homes, because our homes aren't set up to be accessible, or they're not universally designed. So let's talk more about that. Don't worry about remembering these details. I want you to think in broad strokes as we go through the next several slides on the specifics of how something could be set up to be universally designed. So someone's home. Now, something I'll say is that this stuff is easier and more cost-effective to do when the home is being built than it is typically to modify or remodel a home. Just something to think about. The other thing is, in most cases, people's medical or healthcare insurance does not cover home modifications, even if the person is permanently disabled. So if they've had a spinal cord injury or a stroke or something, leg amputation, something that is going to significantly impact their ability to live independently and their quality of life inside their home, still healthcare and medical insurance doesn't see that as their jurisdiction. So now one exception to that is the Veterans Administration or the VA system. Sometimes they will provide a one-time payment to let some modifications to the person's home be made. But in other cases, it has to be privately funded. And so part of our job as OTs is to think about and help our clients think about how we can minimize those costs. What's a way we can make their home accessible and safe without spending, tens of thousands of dollars on this stuff. So entryway, just getting into the home, consider the front door, the back door, any exterior doors. And many times when there is somebody with mobility challenges, the home will be set up so that just one of those doors is accessible. So the other door may have stairs or a big threshold, that kind of lip in between two different flooring surfaces. And that's not the safest, because if there's a fire blocking the other entrance, that might be problematic, but that's how it is in most cases. As long as there's one exterior door that the person can get out with little to no assistance, it's considered, I guess, safe enough. Doorways are standardly 36 inches wide. Usually that's how wide a doorway is in a home. If somebody has a wheelchair and they may have wheels that stick out beyond the actual frame of the chair, and then if they're wheeling themselves, their hands stick out on the outside of those wheels. So sometimes we need to look at a wider doorway, like 40 or 42 inches, if possible. Motion lights, especially for people with low vision. And the second peephole would be one that's lower down. You can kind of see it in that blue sketch on the slide. And that would be for somebody who is seated, so like a wheelchair user, for somebody who is shorter in stature, like a little person, or just somebody who is short, or it might be for a child. So we're talking universal design. So we're not just talking about how this design would work for people with disabilities. Bedroom, lots of things to consider, but largely we want to make sure the path is clear, so there's not a bunch of stuff in the way. There are areas, or at least one space big enough for a full turn in a wheelchair or on a walker without somebody having to back up, is what we're looking for. Built-in storage works well for a lot of people. It usually needs to be secured to the wall, so there's not that tip hazard. And look in that picture through the doorway. Notice that's a very wide doorway, which is really nice. That is what's called a pocket door, which we see in some older homes, but we're starting to see them in newer construction as well, because it makes it easier for people with mobility challenges. They don't have to swing the door in or out and then wheel in. They just push it to the side and it's, inside that wall. But look through that doorway and you will see a couple of cool things. One of them is the cutout underneath the sink. And this is what we really like to see in bathrooms and even in kitchens when there is a wheelchair user. And again, when we're talking universal design, it's a good thing to put in there, even if there's not currently a wheelchair user in the home, if you are building a home. Now, a variation on that is to go ahead and put the cabinet doors, but make them go down to the floor. So there's not a bottom to that cabinet, or if there is one, it's easily removable, so that the cabinet doors in the bottom of the cabinet, if one is there, can easily be removed if wheelchair access is needed later. The second thing I want to call your attention to in that bathroom, and this one's harder to see, but you can kind of use your imagination too, is a wall mounted hair dryer. And this one is set up so that it's switch activated. So the switch on the wall, which is low down enough so that someone who is seated or shorter in stature can easily reach it, it activates, it turns on that fan, which is really nice. I have even seen wall mounted hair dryers like that, which are very handy for somebody who may only have the use of one side of their body, or maybe they have decreased strength and they can't hold a hair dryer because they're kind of heavy, or they can't reach to blow dry behind their head. So it just minimizes the physical demand on that person when we're thinking about those principles of universal design. Speaking of bathrooms, these are some general guidelines that we talk about in terms of universal design. When you install a grab bar, you want to consider, of course, the height, both standing and seated, of the person, but also maybe of the caregivers, because they may be using those to help transfer the person if the person is very dependent. Typically, grab bars are around 3 feet off the floor. Again, check out that sink. There's no cabinet underneath it, so there's clearance under it. In this picture, they have a blow dryer, hand dryer. That's not really probably feasible in many homes, but one thing I do want to point out is what I tend to recommend in something like this would be a very decorative towel holder, so that it looks very different from the grab bars, because one common accident that we see in bathrooms when people have mobility challenges is they reach out for anything they can to hold on to, maintain their balance, or keep from falling or slipping. And so they may grab onto the towel bar or the toilet paper roll, pushing on it to get up from the toilet. And most of the time, those things are not mounted to bear that much weight. So that could be problematic. So you can see there how in this picture, the toilet paper area is actually recessed in the wall instead of having that toilet paper holder there for that exact reason. The kitchen. Now, the bathroom is the area of the home where most falls occur. The kitchen is the second one. So we would want, now this one is very cool because it's got this roll under sink. So, I talked about a pocket door. These are actually pocket cabinets. So if you open those cabinets, that cabinet underneath the sink, those doors then push straight back. So it looks like there are no doors there. And those boards and the threshold down underneath that cabinet just push down flat. They're spring loaded. So it's not hard for somebody in a wheelchair to push those cabinet doors out of the way and then roll up on under the sink so they can reach that. You also would want to, many times you can choose an appliance like a stove that has the controls on the front so that somebody in a wheelchair could reach them. This one doesn't actually look like it's like that to me. Maybe it's lower mounted so somebody could reach it. But raised electrical outlets is another one. And so that's really handy, and lower light switches. And again, the doorways need to be at least 36 inches or 3 feet wide at minimum. This is just an overall home of something that's been set up as ADA compliant. Now, one thing I want to make clear about that is that it is not law that all private homes be ADA compliant. ADA, that accessibility law, is for public spaces, that are open to the public. So sometimes it's not feasible for space reasons, for money reasons, to build a home that's ADA compliant. It may still be universally designed and to a large extent though, and that's the best case scenario. This is just a quick overview of some things that you probably see all the time in the environment, and you might not have known that these are universally designed. Again, making it more accessible, but at the same time, easier to use. So increasing the usability for everybody and expanding the range of users. So that's when the diversity part comes in. Now, this video also doesn't work, so I'm just going to talk you through it. Let's talk about lifestyle redesign. This is an intervention approach that was developed in the OT program at the University of Southern California, or USC. And this program has been shown to improve health and wellness by preventing and managing chronic conditions through building healthier lifestyles. It's part of a larger program called the Well Elderly Study that was also done at USC that shows that OT in the preventative form helps to slow declines associated with typical aging through improving health, functioning, and life satisfaction, and even healthcare costs. But what we're talking about is this lifestyle redesign. So we look at, for this, health overall, creating an environment so that it's easier for everyone to become healthier overall, especially people with chronic conditions. So that includes nutrition, everyday exercise, mental health, all those things specifically for people with chronic conditions. Again, back to universal design and OT intervention. Advocacy and education are two very, very important parts of working with our clients, especially when there are accessibility or access challenges for these clients. So with advocacy, we want to promote occupational justice. And the other side of that coin is we want to help our clients understand and have the self-esteem, I guess, to get what they need, to ask for what they need, to lobby or advocate for themselves. So part of our advocacy efforts might be working with our clients on self-advocacy. In terms of education, we are teaching our clients, and oftentimes they're caregivers too, so they're family members or people that are also involved in their lives on a regular basis, how they can set things up in that person's life to establish and or maintain health, especially when there are problems with access. And so I talked a minute ago about the OTPF and how universal design is connected to that. So I also want to point out that besides context and environment, we also need to look at those client factors. So the things the clients need to be able to do to participate in their chosen occupations, and the performance components. So remember, that's both performance skills and the performance patterns, like their habits and routines and rituals and roles. So we consider really all aspects of the OTPF when we are talking in terms of universal design. Oh my God, I did not hit record. Yes, I did. Ignore that. Oops, okay. Certifications. These are specialty certifications, and this kind of ties to what you guys did last week, that are related to universal design. We're going to talk about 3 of them. There are more out there, but these are the 3 that you will hear the most about as an OT practitioner. And I happen to have 2 of these, so I can talk personally about them in my own professional journey. The first one, and probably very honestly, the easiest one to get, is called the CAPS certification. And that stands for Certified Aging in Place Specialist. And so one thing I want to say about that is it's not just for older people. That aging in place kind of confuses people or sets us up for confusion sometimes, because there are plenty of homes that need to be adapted because there are younger people, younger adults or even kids in the home that need extra support. And so an example of this, I can tell you from my experience, is I'm affiliated with, I know a 27-year-old young man that I worked with when he was in school and when I worked for the schools. And he's probably 6 feet tall. He has severe cerebral palsy. And his mother had a track system installed in the ceiling of her home. So how this works is, say when she pulls in the garage, she has him in the, he's in the back seat. She has a van, so he's actually still in his wheelchair, strapped in. It's, a wheelchair accessible van. There's a ramp that comes out. So she gets him down the ramp, wheels him to the door of the house that the garage is attached to. And she pushes a button, and this sling, it's a giant sling that's suspended from the ceiling, automatically comes over to where she is. And she puts part of the cloth, part of the sling, so the bottom part, underneath her son, and then pushes and then secures it back to the top, and then pushes the button again, and it lifts him a little bit. And then she pushes it a different button and tells it where to take him in the house. So it's almost kind of like a road that you would drive on, but it's for that sling suspension system that is built into the ceiling of their home. So that way she doesn't have to lift this 140-pound man. She's very petite herself, and that would either not be possible or be very dangerous for her. But back to the certification. So this CAPS certification is actually, it's interesting because it's not offered, it's not given through any organization that's affiliated with OT directly, or even anything in healthcare. It's offered by the National Association of Home Builders, or you might see that out there as NAHB. So we have a local one here in Memphis, a local branch of the NAHB. And so you take I think it's a 3-day course through the NAHB, and you get this certification. And the other interesting thing about it is that not too many OTs do this. And so usually there'll be, maybe 1 or 2 OTs in the class at a time. And the rest of the people in the class are all contractors, subcontractors, even just people who want to flip homes. And they just want to learn about universal design. What are the requirements? How can they do things so that they're more usable or even more visitable by people at large? Once you get this certification, there is a requirement to maintain it. You have to take so many hours of continuing ed courses, 12 hours every 2 years, that are specifically related to universal design and home accessibility. So that's the CAPS certification. The other one that I have is the ATP, which stands for Assistive Technology Practitioner. This one is much more challenging to get and maintain. It's administered through an organization called RESNA, which stands for the Rehab Engineering and Society of Assistive Technology Practitioners of North America. mouthful, so people just say RESNA. And you have to have worked in the field for a number of hours, 1,500 hours. So that is roughly 9 months at least, at minimum, to even sit for this exam. You have to have a degree in a healthcare related field. So typically people with an ATP certification are OTs or PTs. They have at least 9 months of experience working with people with access challenges with technology. And then you have to study and sit for a 4-hour exam, the ATP exam, which it's on par with the NBCOT exam. I took this about a dozen years ago, and the test itself costs $500. Again, very similar to NBCOT exam. You have to score a minimum score and then you pass it. It's like 80% of everything right. But I studied for the exam. I prepared for it for a year. That's how much information is on there. And then once you get that certification, you have to complete 12 hours of continuing ed every licensure cycle. So that's the criteria to maintain. And then you have to pay the fee, which I think is $85. It's not an exorbitant amount, but to be recertified whenever your licensure cycle comes up. The last certification I'm going to talk to you about is actually a graduate certificate. So this is for OTs who have graduated. So they finished OT school. It is 3 courses. Each course is 4 credit hours long, just like foundations. So it's a total of 12 credit hours that you take through the University of Southern California. And you then can become a lifestyle redesign coach, and you'll know all about lifestyle redesign and universal design and accessibility, things like that. All right, another one that's not working. So we're going to kind of skip over that. My video links are a bust in this. I need to redo those. I think there was an update to PowerPoint and that threw me off. Now, one aspect of universal design that is just a subcategory of universal design is actually called universal design for learning, or it is often abbreviated UDL. And that looks at how can we make the curriculum or the learning accessible to all students. This is something that's looked at a lot in kindergarten through 12th grade, not as much in higher education, but more and more we're looking at that. Typically how that goes down in higher ed is when there is a learner or a student with a specific need. So say there's somebody with a visual perceptual problem or a hearing acuity problem, they might ask the instructor and get approved through the disability services support office on campus to have accommodations to get to have subtitles on all videos, on even on PowerPoints on the screen, closed captioning. They might want to have images with descriptors, so written descriptions of what's in a photo if they can't see those photos well enough, things like that. And so then the professors will be told you need to do this. And then the good news about that is it's done for future years. So that's really handy. It's not necessarily, universal design is not mandated by law for learning, unless it is for a specific individual and they have that in their IEP as part of IDEA in kindergarten through 12th grade. Now, an aspect of UDL is universal design in education. And this specifically goes beyond just making education accessible for students with disabilities. it's kind of like the parallel of accessibility is to universal design, as universal design for learning is to universal design for education, if you like those kind of comparisons. So UDE looks at, is the school accessible, not just for students with disabilities, but all students, parents who are going to be probably coming in the school building, staff, administrators, of course, we want them to be able to access everywhere in the school, and even visitors. So if they're coming in for a book fair, a PTA meeting, maybe they're going to read to a first grade class, and they're just a community member, maybe an author that's come in and they're going to read to students, or a guest speaker for the PTA meeting or an assembly. These visitors might have accessibility needs, and so we need to pre-consider that and set that up. Equal play for all. Something that's very near and dear to my heart. Next time you are around a playground, look at it from the lens of universal design and accessibility. Are there wood chips? Is there gravel? What sort of surface is it? And would a wheelchair user or somebody on a walker or forearm crutches or somebody with a visual impairment, would they be able to safely get to it and use it? Many more and more playgrounds are being set up so that they are universally designed. Signs are lower. There is a ramp option, which is very nice. So people who are in wheelchairs don't have to be carried or crawl up the stairs to play there. There is even color coding that is used, and sometimes it's color coded by age. So, the younger kids the blue stuff is more for them, and the older kids, the red stuff is more for them. But sometimes it's color coded just to draw attention to it, to help for people that are visually impaired. The Disability Gas Coalition. Now, let me point out that with gas prices the way they are now, this is not a group that advocates for lowering of gas prices. Instead, it's a group that advocates for accessible gas pumps. So for people with physical and other types of challenges, but specifically physical challenges, how do they pump their gas? We have adapted vehicles for people like this gentleman who can drive himself. He doesn't need someone to come with him in the car to help him, but he can't pump the gas, mainly because look how high that credit card thing is. And so this group is advocating for lowering of things so they can reach them, and also for requiring gas stations to have a system so that the person that needs help can just punch a button. If they can't reach the credit card or any of the others, they can push a button and somebody will come out. Now, with employment the way it is now, and it's hard to sometimes find employees, most gas stations just have one person on duty at a time, and they're inside working at the cash register. So they're not going to come out if you punch a button for assistance at the pump in states where that's not legally mandated. So that's the purpose of this group. Airports. Those are a big area that we need to get better at from an accessibility standpoint. If you've ever seen somebody with any specific type of a challenge or disability trying to go through security at an airport, you have some idea of what I'm talking about. It's much more of a hassle. It takes much longer. And in a lot of ways, it's almost kind of embarrassing or maybe even dehumanizing for them if they're being treated like they're doing something wrong just because they're in a wheelchair. Are we more suspicious? Do we think they're doing something incorrectly? So we have to hand scan them because the scanners are going to light up because the wheelchairs are metal. But specifically, I want you to think about airplanes, plane travel, and how that might work for somebody with a wheelchair or a walker, or, visual impairment, even, arthritis and those, how the seat belts work, or the little latch that you use to drop down the tray table on the back of the seat in front of you when you're flying. Even just thinking about wheelchair users alone, we know that there are big problems. And as of now, most of the time when wheelchair users fly, they either have to be catheterized or they just have to time it so that they're not going to have to use the bathroom on the flight, because there's no way that wheelchair is getting through that bathroom door on the plane. In fact, even if they had somebody that could help them into the bathroom, two adults can't fit in those bathrooms very much at all. So it's problematic. And we're starting to see some regulations come down, and ADA law is going to be expanded, I'm fairly certain, to include airports and planes over time. So that'll be good news. All right, we're about to wrap it up, but I want to call your attention to a resource that you can learn more about accessibility in travel, in fact, international travel, through a friend of mine named Fletcher Cleaves. Fletcher's a Memphian, and he had a scholarship to play football in college. And right before he left to go to preseason training, he and a friend of his were driving along a 2-lane road, and the driver coming in the opposite direction was texting, not paying attention, and swerved into their lane and made them run off the road, and their vehicle flipped several times, and Fletcher ended up with a pretty high-level spinal cord injury. Both of the people in this drawing are Fletcher. It might be confusing. When I told this story once and showed this picture, and somebody thought that was Fletcher and his friends, but this is Fletcher. It's two of him, but he calls himself the wheelchair nomad. And this guy travels internationally all over the world, 10 times more than most other people I know. He will often take friends with him, and they know how to help him, but he's pretty independent. He also has a super cool truck that's fully adapted for him, and maybe we'll get him to come in and guest speak later in the school year. He's gone a lot because he's a wheelchair nomad, but I recommend that you check out his story on his website, FletcherCleaves.com, and or follow him on Instagram under the Wheelchair Nomad. He posts a good bit on Instagram, and you can see all about the successes and the challenges that he has when he is traveling that way. And that's the end of the presentation. Thank you for your attention. Again, be sure to go back to those learning objectives and make sure you are square with those.